Hello and welcome to Dev's Advocate, a podcast where a couple of indie game developers talk to and get to know other indie game developers. Before we get to into our interview today, I just want to have a little public service announcement for all the developers out there. Please back up your projects and use GitHub if you can, because mine just got corrupted and I'm in a spiral of a nightmare right now.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that happened to you.
It's not I don't have to start completely from scratch, but it's just going to be a lot of very tedious and monotonous work to get it back to where it was.
I'm so sorry. It's going to work out though for you in the end.
Yeah. Okay, so with that said, today on our show we have Trever Mock. Hi, Trevor.
Hey, how's it going, guys? Excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I've been following your work on Twitter for a while. Before we get into the nitty gritty of what you've been doing lately, one thing that I noticed, just getting to know different game developers is if you ever ask them to, talk about their personal lives a bit and their upbringing. Most of the time, they usually say they spent a lot of time in their childhood playing video games and stuff, which is obviously integral to them getting into game development. So can you tell us a bit about yourself as far as your history goes and how that all led into you wanting to get into game development?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So yeah, first off, thanks again for having me on. I'm excited to be here and everything. And yeah, so a little bit about myself. My name's Trever Mock. I'm a software engineer, and I also do indie game development in my free time. And a little bit about my upbringing and just how I got into indie game development and everything. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of video games, like I think any other indie game developer. I kind of grew up with them, all that good stuff. And really kind of what draws me to them is just such a cool medium that brings together so many other art forms. Actually, growing up, I was pretty big into music and I actually played in guitar in a heavy metal band for about 7 years.
Oh, cool.
And so I was super hard set on actually becoming a professional musician. And I was doing like indie games and that kind of stuff on the side just because I kind of like that stuff. And I've always had a lot of interests in a lot of different places. So right now, that's kind of where I'm at, is working on a game and being part of the indie game development community, which is something I've been getting into more recently.
Mm-hmm.
I've always done my projects kind of on the side, and then just this last, I think I've been on Twitter maybe about 6 or 7 months now, and I've really been kind of learning about it and getting into it.
Mm-hmm.
So can you tell us about the current game you're working on?
Sure, yeah, of course. I'm working on a precision platformer kind of game. I have it kind of untitled out there right now, but I did come up with a title for it, and I have like kind of a small group of close friends and stuff that I bounce ideas off of, and they help play test and all that good stuff. And I've gone through story and fleshing that out with them as well. But I'm going to call it the Path of Ren. And so the Path of Ren is basically a precision platformer game. It's really similar to games like Celeste and Super Meat Boy. And it takes place in this spirit world-like setting that's between life and death. And it's going to be extremely story-driven. That's something that's really important to me, although I haven't been able to show that as much on social media. I've got a whole story kind of fleshed out behind it. And yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from like anime and like Studio Ghibli films. I don't know how familiar you guys are with that whole world or anything. But yeah.
Just to say, so we just got the exclusive name drop.
Yeah, I was going to say the official title reveal right here on Dev's Advocate.
It really is. Yeah, I haven't talked about it publicly at least yet.
Well, thank you for that.
Oh, no problem, guys. Yeah.
You're developing the entire game all by yourself?
Yeah. So I am. So I do have somebody. So being part of the music scene and stuff, growing up and everything, I know tons and tons of musicians. So when I kind of put it out there that I was working on a video game, I had a lot of people reach out to me and they're like, "Hey, I really want to do the music for this and everything." And so I do have somebody else doing the music for it. And I mean, I would be really excited to do the music myself, but at the same time, having that kind of taken off of my plate a little bit and having somebody else who's actually done some really awesome things. They've never worked on a video game before, but they've done some really cool like commercials, and they've done some like scores for film and that kind of stuff. I'm really excited to have them working on it. So they're going to do the music for it, and I'm working very closely with them on that, of course. But other than that, yeah, everything else is all me.
Very cool.
Awesome. What are like the mechanics, if you can describe the game for someone who's not looking at the game? What are the mechanics of the game and how does it flow?
Sure, yeah. So right now I really consider the game to be in kind of a prototype kind of phase. I'm really figuring out, what the game actually feels like, what it looks like still. I know that's almost kind of a weird thing to say. It's like about 7 or so months into this project and everything, but that's just, that's the process of building. I'm trying to build my skills and really make something, I can be proud of there. But kind of back to your question. So I'm still kind of figuring out exactly how the game's going to flow. I think I'm leaning towards something that's going to be closer to like a game like Celeste, for example, where it's like you've got all this precision platforming, but one level kind of flows right into the other level, as opposed to having like a UI where it's like, here's level 1, here's level 2, and so on. So I'm really going to go with, at least right now, because I want a very story-driven kind of, backing to the game. I think that's going to fit a little better as far as how that flows. And then mechanic-wise, basically, so you play as this character, and you've got your traditional platforming, your typical run and jump. You can also cling and climb on any wall or on any ceiling. And then the kind of, I guess, tricky part, you could say, is you collect these things that I'm calling orbs. And when you collect an orb, it gives you some special mechanic, right? And so right now I've only got a couple of those. I've got lots and lots of ideas for other ones. But basically the idea is, right, you'd collect an orb and it'll give you the ability to do a dash, or you collect an orb and it'll give you the ability to do like a fly move, or I'm working on this cool like ghost trail move right now that that's got tons of bugs in it that hopefully maybe I'll be able to show a little this next month. So yeah, that's I guess kind of a hopefully quick rundown there.
Mm-hmm. But I know you said you're comparing it to Celeste. From the screenshots, the animated screenshots I've seen, it's not a single screen game though. You do scroll through the levels.
Yeah, that is correct. So it's definitely it's definitely kind of like I'm really kind of crossing that boundary between a Metroidvania game and just like a precision platformer, right? So I'm going to have a lot of things that are very Metroidvania-like. I might not necessarily have upgrades and those kinds of things, but I guess to look at like the feel of the game, right? Like one of the draws of the game, I really want to be like exploration and exploring this kind of world. But at the same time, the core focus is going to be precision platforming, right? And each challenge you come across, it's going to be about platforming, right? There's not going to be any combat or anything like that. But yeah, exactly what you just said, right? It's definitely like a bit of a side scroller, and you're kind of side scrolling through these levels rather than, if that, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Did you start working on the game just like, all right, here's a blank project in Unity, I'm just gonna like see if I can make a character move and then go from there? Or was like, I have this idea to make this game, it's gonna be a platform and do this and that? How did it evolve?
Sure, that's a great question. Let me think about how I want to answer that. So
There's no wrong answer.
Yeah. No, right. Yeah, so how I went about it, I guess I'm going to answer this in a couple different ways. So I didn't start with just a blank Unity project. I come from like a software engineering kind of background, and I, the idea there, you really try to reuse things when you can, and you try not to reinvent the wheel and all of that kind of stuff. So I've taken some of those practices, and I actually started with a project by Mix and Jam. And it's a project where they tried to, it's out there on YouTube, and it's a project where they basically tried to recreate some of the movement that's done in Celeste. And so I started with that as a base, because I was like, that'll at least get me, a character moving around and all that good stuff. And I've gone through the whole process of building game engines and building platformers from scratch and all that stuff, and I just wasn't interested. I wanted to get to the game part, right?
Yeah. And they're done that.
Yeah, so so I started with that, and then that's definitely evolved. I mean, I've ripped out pretty much all of it at this point and replaced it, but I definitely started with something rather than starting with just a blank project.
Yeah, cool.
So what made you want to continue building on it? I mean, I know that's always usually a good jumping off point doing a game jam, but obviously, well, it seems like, I guess what I'm asking is, what were the inspirations that made you want to stick with it and build it into something of your own, other than, the visual aspect of it, which you already mentioned, Anime Studio Ghibli type stuff?
Definitely, yeah. So even before kind of starting this project, um, I really wanted to kind of portray just some kind of story, and I can give you guys a little information maybe on like the backbone of the story and kind of where I'm going with it and the scope of the game and that kind of stuff. It's all stuff that I've been fleshing out like crazy, but I can tell you I've had this kind of raw backbone since even before starting the game, and I was like, I want to make a game about this basically, right? And so let me start here. So the game is going to be, it's going to be 5 zones in total. And so each zone is going to be, for example, what you see on Twitter right now with all the cherry blossoms and that kind of, brighter art and that kind of stuff. That's all one zone, right? And so I'm starting to kind of come out with some other posts with this like bamboo forest kind of theme. That's going to be another zone, right? So they're each going to be very distinct in their appearance as well as their story and also, of course, their mechanics. And yeah, they'll be made up of a variety of levels, quote unquote levels, right? So it's not like you're selecting level 1, level 2, but it's like you're kind of flowing through, here's level 1 of the platformer, and now the challenge is getting bigger. We're making this mechanic more complicated, and that kind of stuff. So on a more abstract level, the game is really about the process of pursuing some ambitious goal without not necessarily knowing where that goal will take you or even if you'll succeed or not. And so those 5 different zones are really representations of different steps that I think at least, and kind of how I've broken apart that process of achieving some ambitious goal and kind of exploring fulfillment and what that means. And so I can give a quick overview really quick of the 5 zones and what they are and kind of how they relate to that. So
Sure.
Cool. So the first zone is called renewal. That's kind of what I've been calling it. I don't know what it'll end up being called, if anything. And that's really the cherry blossoms and all that kind of stuff. And that's really the idea and the beauty of having a dream or having some ambitious goal to work towards. And this is kind of really about the conception of what that is and what that means. The second zone is going to be about exploration. And so I chose a forest to represent that. And that's really the exploration of what that dream or what that ambitious goal means and, what that could bring and so on, right? And so it's this idea that, as you're exploring, something really big like that, the more you explore into it, the more dangerous it feels. But at the same time, if you stop exploring, it dies altogether. And so I'm really going to be trying to capture some of those concepts and this contrast of exploration versus, danger and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I started showing that one a little bit on social media. Right now, I'm actually in the process of fleshing out the next zone, which is going to be about distraction. And I chose a city to represent that. And it's really about the distractions that prevent you from actually working towards the things that are most important, right? And so, I mean, just a couple examples, working a dead-end job or working a job that you hate. I have a little bit of a corporate background, and I hated working for a corporate company. That's a whole nother topic. Yeah. and so I've channeled all my hatred towards that in this sense. No, but it's really about the distractions that keep you from pursuing the things that you actually want to be pursuing. And so that's what that zone's about. And then the next zone is about fear and doubt. And I'm going to represent that, I think, with like a dark desert wasteland kind of thing. And I haven't necessarily started fleshing out this zone and what it actually looks like just yet, but it's really going to encompass kind of those negative emotions that that just come with the process of pursuing something really big and ambitious. And then the last zone is going to be about fulfillment, and it's going to kind of wrap all that up in a sense, and it's going to really show it's really going to explore, what is fulfillment, and is pursuing something in fulfillment, or is achieving something fulfillment, and what does that look like a little bit, right? And I think there's a lot of ways to spin that, and I'm still kind of fleshing out and figuring out exactly what that's going to look like. And so that's so back to your original question, right? That's kind of the backbone of the game, and that's kind of the inspiration that I wanted to go off of. I really just wanted to explore this idea of, what is it to be fulfilled, and what is it to, work towards some ambitious goal, and is that fulfillment? Or if not, what is, right? And so I'm going to have some other characters that you kind of meet along the way, and we're going to explore, their character arcs and those kinds of things. Corresponding to different zones and all that, which will kind of encompass what each one of those steps means. And so that's the backbone I built it off of, and so that's been kind of my inspiration for everything. So any decision that I make for the game, whether that's for example, that first area, cherry blossoms, and I want to portray that everywhere, not just because of the strong kind of Japanese or like Ghibli or anime themes that go with it, which I think are cool, just in general. But because they represent that idea of renewal, and that idea that to start something else has to end, or when something else ends, right? It's a whole cycle. Something else is starting, and it's not necessarily about that destination, but it's about those moments within that. And yeah, I think that answers. Hopefully, that answers the question. I didn't drift too far from that.
No, I think that's really interesting how many emotions and like feelings are tied to each level. Is that coming from somewhere personal, or is it just sort of an idea you had of like, what if you flow through this kind of, it's almost like a life adventure that you're describing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm sure it's personal as well. It's probably a little bit of both, right? It's definitely personal, but it's definitely a little bit of this idea as well. And I look at it in a couple ways, right? Like when I was in my band, right, I feel like we achieved some pretty great things. We didn't. I don't know. It's like that as soon as you've gotten to a level in something where it's like, wow, I didn't think I would get here, right? I didn't think I would be touring the country, or I didn't think my indie game would sell this much. You don't really feel fulfilled. I mean, you feel fulfilled in some sense, but now all of a sudden you're like, well, this journey's over. What next? And that kind of really inspired, and that's been pretty repetitive throughout my life so far, right? With the band, or even pursuing software engineering, right? And so I went and got a degree in computer science and did all that stuff and became the software engineer. And for the longest time, I was like, man, I just want a good paying job, and I want to be doing something I like every day. And it's like, okay, I'm there. What next? Right? It's like it's that you really can't be looking at the destination. And I know that's a total cliche, right? It's about the journey, not the destination. But I think that's really kind of what I'm getting at with all of that.
I think it's cliche for a reason, because especially for people like game developers, that journey is gonna have to be enjoyable, because if all you're thinking about is the destination, you're going to not be a very happy camper.
Oh, exactly, man. Exactly. Yeah.
And I was gonna ask if it just right off the bat, I was like, oh, it's an allegory for being a game developer, but I guess it is a very universal kind of process for anybody who is trying to achieve a long-term goal, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think it spreads across really any like you said, it's universal, right? It's something that it could be in really any industry, right? And I mean, I've seen it in music, I've seen it in software, obviously super relevant in game development as well. And I'm sure all other kinds of forms of art. But yeah, I completely agree.
So how did you start as a game developer? I mean, you said you're coming from a software developer background, but specifically, did you start out with just researching and finding out about Unity and then doing game jams, or how did your game developer journey come about?
Sure. Yeah. Great question. So I think what it comes down to is even from a really young age, I've really always been interested in telling a story, right? And so the earliest thing I can or the earliest like game development I can remember doing was back when I was, I think, in elementary school, and I would just, see something that inspired me, maybe on, TV. I'd watch some cool SpongeBob episode, and I'd be like, "Wow, that was cool!" And I would jump into RPG Maker, and I would create these little scenarios, and I'd build out these very small, unpolished, games in RPG Maker. And so that's kind of the earliest thing that I can think of, as far as that goes. And then, of course, I went to school for computer science, and I kind of went down that software path. But I mean, part of me, there's a lot of reasons for that. And part of me knew that if I was better at programming, I'd be able to maybe make games better. And then there's a lot that, kind of surrounds that choice as well. But I mean, I've always kind of been making games. So from RPG Maker, I went to actually doing, and this is, I guess, a little bit more in the future, right? More during college. I did like Java OpenGL. And so the reason for that was in college, they were teaching Java. And so that's what I knew. That's what I was learning. So I went and I was like, how do I make games in Java? And so, yeah, Java OpenGL, I followed a bunch of YouTube tutorials and I built out my own little 3D game engine. I did a bunch of other really small projects that are just small things that I've never released in Java-related frameworks. libgdx is one that I used quite a bit. And then it wasn't until after college, when I got a corporate job, I was on a really large-scale C# project. And then I kind of came across Unity around the same time. And I was enjoying C# for the most part. It was very Java-like. And when I came across Unity, it was this really magical thing, because up until that point, I had really been building out my own game engines. And then Unity was this other side of the thing where it's like, the game engine's done, now actually go build the game, right? Actually go tell your story. And so that's really what drew me into Unity over those. And really it was a combination of that and that familiarity with, I'm like, okay, this isn't C#. I work in C# right now. I can do this kind of thing. And then, of course, I mean, Unity's got so many resources and all that kind of stuff out there as well that it was super easy to get into from there. And so, yeah, I created a lot of unfinished, just unpolished games in Unity. So I've done anything from like tower defense games to like 3D RPGs to platformers, casual phone games, all things that some of them I released in very small form, but I've never actually, what am I trying to say? I've never actually like publicly released anything. I've never marketed anything until my current project. That's really what the challenge I'm trying to take on with my current project is to not only create something, but for one, follow up through to the finish, and then for two, maybe actually grow some people that are actually interested in that.
So how has the community been? You've been posting on Twitter since last September, something like that, and getting feedback. What's that been like versus kind of just doing it in the dark on your own?
Yeah, it's really been kind of revolutionary to actually be posting about a project and actually gathering feedback, and I don't know, like throwing it out there and being vulnerable and learning what's working and what's not working, right? Because when you're developing a game without doing that, you're really doing it in the dark, and it's like you could show it to friends or whatever, and they can give you their feedback. But when you throw it on social media, you definitely get some some good honest feedback, or you don't get any feedback at all, and that also tells you something, right? It's not engaging enough, or it's not interesting enough. So it's been an awesome experience, and for anyone else listening that's working on a game that's not throwing it out there on social media, I'd really encourage you to give that a shot, even if it's just like a once every couple weeks kind of thing. Because I think it's changed my whole perspective on how you should be developing a game and as an indie developer.
Good to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I started sharing my project around the same time, actually, around last August, September. And yeah, I found that to be true as well. The community on Twitter was surprisingly supportive, actually, giving all the nightmares I hear about Twitter usually.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. I completely agree. Like the community on Twitter, and I actually started with Instagram, and then I joined Twitter like a month after I started posting my project on Instagram. But both communities, just indie game development in general, everyone is just so supportive and so great. And Yeah, I mean, it's been just a great experience overall, and it's this terrifying thing if you haven't done it, right? At least for me, it was this huge terrifying thing because I really wasn't into social media at all. It was very new to me getting into it for game development. Like I had an
Mhm.
Instagram page, and I would, when I was in the band, I would post these, little pictures and stuff every once in a while, and they would get a couple likes or whatever.
Mhm.
It's just this whole different experience when you actually take something that you're really working on in this project that you care about, and you're posting that out there, and you're actually doing it in a way where you're using hashtags and you're trying to actually get eyes on it, and then you do get eyes on it and people are actually commenting on it, and it's not only encouraging and fulfilling while you're going through that, but it's it's just all around a good thing, right? You're gaining feedback, you're getting encouragement, and you're building an audience, not only for
Mhm.
that game, but if you do it in the right way, that audience could be for your next game. You could spin off and you could do some animated series afterwards. You could even, if you've built an audience, you can go and release a full length album after you've made an indie game. And people are going to buy that album because maybe they liked your game and now they want to
Mhm.
see, what you've done. Whereas if you don't have that audience built, um, you're just not gonna, you could release this awesome album or this awesome game and you're gonna get zero, potentially, zero downloads.
So, coming from a software background, how do you compare working game development versus the applications you were writing before?
Yeah, so I definitely like both. And software engineering and programming and all that's definitely, um, I would say, kind of my strong area when it comes to game development. Now, how much I liked working on applications versus game development, I love game development so much more. And that's not to
Mhm.
say that I don't not enjoy working on applications too, right? There's kind of two sides to it. Like what I really like about working on applications, and so I worked in the aerospace and defense kind of industry for software development, and we got to work on some really really cool, really useful projects. Um,
Mhm.
and so that part of it, and the idea of, man, this thing I built is gonna be so, so useful, versus in indie game development, it's like when you're creating a game, especially something like a platformer game or something, it's like a lot of people are doing that. It's not like you're necessarily solving a problem, right? And that's not to say you shouldn't do it, right? You definitely should. And then I would say the thing that I like, so that's my thought on like application development and why I would say I like application development, right? The usefulness of it. Now, game
Mhm.
development I like because it encompasses just so many other skills. And I'm somebody that likes to learn and likes to have my hands in a bunch of different stuff. And so when you're looking at something like game development, it's like you're programming, right? But when you're programming, it's like you're bringing together this whole picture of, art and music and, even in the indie scene, like marketing and branding and all that stuff. Um, and it's just this really beautiful thing to kind of bring all together. And then programming is really kind of what ties that together. And so I really like that process of, it's like, well, maybe today I don't feel like programming. Well, I'm going to go do some pixel
Mm.
art, right? Or I'm going to
Mhm.
go work on some
Mhm.
music. And when you're working in application development, it's like, today I don't feel like programming.
Nope.
I'm going to be doing programming today,
Mhm.
regardless, right?
Very fair, yeah.
So for most people, I think, just people around me, my friends, I show them the stuff I do and like all the code I've done, and they look at it, they're like, what is this? Um,
Yeah.
they, for them, programming is a big hurdle, but for somebody like yourself who comes from software development, and getting into game development, what have been your biggest challenges?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And so for me, it's definitely been the art, right? It's been, so this is actually the first project. A lot of my past projects that I was talking about, I would do the programming, I build out all these robust systems for and everything, and then my art would be like a couple squares, right? It would be this very simple art because I've never really been able to do that art, and I had really convinced myself at that point, Trevor, you're a programmer. You're not an artist, right? And that's just such a limiting mindset to put on yourself.
Mhm.
And so with this project, what I've really tried to do is do kind of an art first approach. I watched some other kind of marketing videos and stuff on YouTube, and how some other indie game developers were going about marketing their projects, because I wanted to do something that
Mhm.
I could potentially gain an audience with. And what most of that, or the key takeaway that I took away from that was, if you're building all these robust systems and programming and everything, that's great, and you're going to make the game feel really good. But you're not going to be able to get people to play your game necessarily by doing that, right? And so they kind of recommend this art first kind of approach, where you really try to, even though you want to build out these systems and everything, you try to almost limit that a little bit and kind of tell yourself, I need to, gain interest in this, and at the same time as I'm building these systems, I need to be working on the art. So that's been the biggest challenge for me, is really the art part of it. And so as far as like pixel art and everything goes, it's something I started doing with this project. I really hadn't done, I'd done a little bit of pixel art before, but really not much. And I've kind of been learning as I've been going with this project. And it's so weird because I would say every month or so, or like I look back at my social media posts, and this is also, tying back to what we were talking about social media. You're kind of keeping this record of your progress while you're posting on social media as well, right? So I can look back on these older social media posts and be like, oh man, that was some bad pixel art. And I can kind of see how far I've come since then. And I think I've still got a long way to go to get to the point I want to for this game. But yeah, that's been the biggest challenge for me, is actually the art side of it.
Do you enjoy that process, or are you still at the point where it's a bit of a chore?
Oh man, I actually love it. So I didn't love it, or I didn't think I would love it as much as I do when I was getting into it. Like, it definitely felt like a huge chore at first, and I was like, man, I love building out the back end to these games and everything, but I'm like, I'm not very good at the art. And at first it was like a very painful process. It was like I'd sit down, I'd be like, I kind of want to work on creating this mechanic and programming that and everything, but I'm like, I should really work on what this mechanic looks like. And so I'd sit down and force myself to do that pixel art or whatever. And as soon as I started, and I think posting on social media definitely helps with this, because you start getting feedback and you start realizing, hey, maybe I can do this. But yeah, for me, it was very much as soon as I started feeling like, as soon as I got rid of that limiting mindset, and I was really like, hey, yeah, I can do this versus I'm not meant to do this. I really started enjoying it. And now actually one of my favorite things to do on the game is to sit down and put on some, background piano music or something and just go at it with pixel art. And I honestly almost like that more than the programming at this point.
You seem very self-aware about a lot of things development-wise. You also describe in your Twitter that this whole process is iterative and keeps evolving. One question I always have for other developers is, how do you know when to say, okay, this feature or this piece of art is good enough, I need to move on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's okay. Back to that last question, it's like, what do you find challenging? Yeah, that's challenging. So for me, it's very much, I reach a point where I'm working on something. Maybe I've been working on something for a day or so, or a couple days, and I have this initial inspiration where I'm making really good progress, and mind you, this is just for me. I'm definitely not saying that this is everybody, but for me, it's very much, I reach a point where I'm making less and less progress, and I'm starting to tweak these very small little things. And so as soon as I get to that point, I tell myself, okay, this is done for now, right? I'm starting to tweak these little things back and forth, and I can't decide on them. I'm going to call that good, and maybe I'll come back to it later, right? And I think a good example of that in my game, and anyone can kind of go to my Instagram or even Twitter and kind of scroll through my feed and go down to see my first cuts of the player character. And I was really proud of the player character I did at the time, but I really made it a point to stop myself from trying to perfect it on the first try, because I knew my art skills weren't really that great at that time. And so what I ended up with didn't necessarily, it wasn't going to be the final product or anything, but I knew I was going to come back to that later. And actually recently I have come back to that later, and I redid them as more of like a pixel art style. And I'm really happy with what I came up with. But I'm still leaving that completely open, right? I might come back, and after I've iterated more and I've learned pixel art better, I might come back and even redo him, right? And it's this idea that you really want to switch your mindset Because when you're focusing in on something for too long, you're starting to do these like little tweaks and everything, and you find that you're really not improving it as much as maybe you were when you first started off, making that thing. Yeah, I think that's when you should probably stop and just realize, hey, it doesn't have to be done, right? But maybe it's good enough, or maybe I'll come back to it later when I've developed those skills and I'm able to do something or create that vision that I want to.
Has any of the art you made for your game informed or inspired mechanics? For example, like when I designed my character, he's got like this big pompadour hairdo, and I was like, well, what if he uses that to pick stuff up and throw it at characters, So, but that
Yeah.
came after I created the design. So has there been anything like that with the art you created where you were like, oh, maybe this could be used, functionally somehow?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, there's a couple things that come to my mind right away with that. So in the story of my game and everything, the player's dead. He's got a halo, right? And actually, this isn't something that I thought of myself, but through playtesting the game with some close friends and everything, they were like, man, he's got this halo, but it doesn't really like. What if he could like use the halo to do stuff? Like, what if he could like use the halo as a lasso or something like that? And so it's kind of got my mind now on, yeah, well, maybe I could do some cool mechanics with that halo. And not saying that I will do that, but that's something that's in the back of my head now for sure. And I think at some point I might try to do something with that. So that's one way that comes to mind. And there's actually another way that inspired me to kind of redesign the character just a little bit. And so this is almost the opposite of what you're saying, right? And so this is that I created the character, and he has this really big head, right? He kind of looks like a little bit like a pop figure or something almost. But I wanted to do this mechanic where he was able to climb on the ceiling, and it would just look super awkward because it's like I would have to stretch out his arms so much for him to actually look like he's
bonk.
climbing on the ceiling. Exactly, yeah. And so it's like, man, I like that the character has a big head. I feel like it makes him stand out a little bit, but at the same time, it's making some of these mechanics a little difficult. And so that's something I'm still trying to figure out a little bit. I think with kind of the rework I did of the player character, it's a little bit better. It's something I'm still improving on a little bit though, and I don't necessarily want the answer of that to be I'm going to get rid of a mechanic, and I also don't want the answer to be I'm going to change how the character, I'm going to shrink the character's head. I don't think that's a good solution in my head either. And so you might say, well, there aren't any solutions. Those are the two solutions. And maybe that's true. But that's part of innovation and really experimenting around with things. It's like, how can I find that third solution? And so yeah, it's something I'm still kind of searching for a little bit. But yeah, hopefully that I think that kind of answers that.
I have basically almost the same question, but not about art. When you're adding new things to Unity, like mechanics, are you saying, "Oh, what if I just made this mechanic and then apply it to the game?" Or is it, "Oh, for the game, I really need to have this mechanic"? Is it more just like I'm experimenting with Unity? Oh, that's really cool. I make a black hole or something. Maybe I can fit that into the game. Or is it I really need a black hole?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely a little bit of both. And I can give you a good example of kind of a way that I think Unity, or just like programming in Unity, kind of inspired a mechanic. And that it's something I haven't shown on social media yet. It's this move. It's like this kind of ghost trail mechanic move. It's going to be a new orb that I haven't shown on social media or anything just yet, that I've kind of been working on. Hopefully, I'll start showing that this next month. But the idea behind the mechanic is you kind of leave this ghost trail, right? And then you can shoot through that ghost trail, and it's going to let you pass through any harmful objects, right? And so it lets me kind of come up with these cool little puzzles where it's like, well, you're going for this orb, and then now your mindset all of a sudden switches, and you're like, okay, now I can go through things I couldn't go through before. And it was really kind of inspired by I was playing with the another mechanic in the game, which was it's like the flight mechanic is how I refer to it. And it's this little orb you pick up, and it lets you kind of fly around and everything. And there was a bug where it was just letting me pass through just about anything. And so I was like, well, maybe this could be something that turns into an actual, when I was playing around with it and everything, I was kind of like, maybe there's some potential here. Maybe that can be kind of some unique platformer move, right? And so I tried to innovate off of that and tried to really come up with something that fit that a little more. And like I said, that'd still be working out. But I think that answers your question there.
So what are your ambitions for this game as far as just commercially speaking? Like, do you want to sell it? Do you want to turn it into a franchise?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. So I can say I don't know exactly what my ambitions are for the game, and I know that might seem like a weird answer, but I think there are so many different possibilities that can come from something. I think this is something that I think a good amount of indie game developers have their head wrapped around this, especially if you've got like an entrepreneurial mindset. But I'm sure some don't, so I'll kind of spell it out a little bit. And that is that when you're creating something like this, you can really, and you're building an audience while you're doing it, you can do a lot of things with that audience, right? And so I'd say my ambition for the game is to hopefully build a little bit of an audience while I'm creating it. And then from there, let's say I get to a point where I finish and release the game. To answer your first part of that question, I do plan on selling it and releasing it commercially and all that kind of stuff. I'd like for it to be on multiple platforms, and I haven't looked into that a ton, so I mean we'll see how that goes. But I'd love for it to be on whatever the current Nintendo platform is at the time, PlayStation, Xbox, PC, so on. But let's see, what was I saying? So there's this idea when you're building an audience and everything, you can really do anything with that audience, right? And so after I finish the game, my ambitions after that could be a lot of different things, right? Maybe I will. I've just been part of the community so far. I've seen some good pain points on people that are the opposite way as me, right? They have all these art skills, but they're struggling with the programming. Maybe I can start some kind of side business or some kind of side hustle where I'm creating Unity scripts and custom Unity scripts and so on, and then start turning that into some kind of part-time job almost. So I mean, that's a path. I could go down to YouTube and I could show, hey, this is how I made and released my game. Because I think people find that interesting. Or I could make another game that kind of, that either relates to that game, or I've got, of course, tons of ideas for other games. I think any indie game developer has probably, lots of ideas for games they want to create. Or I could even go down another route. And so for me, it's really about being able to tell a story. And it doesn't have to be, I really like game development because it brings together so many other forms of art, but I'm also really interested in things like illustration and like I think it'd be so cool to create like an anime or something. And so it's like, maybe I take that audience and I create some anime, and maybe that's based off of the game, if I'm able to build that into its own IP or something like that. And I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at here really is there's so many possibilities, and I'm excited about all of them, no matter, which way that could go. And I mean, just being involved and doing the game, hopefully that'll get me to one of those possibilities. So when I say I don't know, it's a little more like it could be anything.
So my final question for you is, now that you're a little over half a year in, what tips would you throw back to people just starting indie game dev or 2D platform dev or Unity dev that you've learned along the way?
Yeah, so let me think about that. So I would say, so the thing I mentioned about, so if you're a software engineer getting into indie game development, I'd have a specific tip for you, and that is go and learn some of the art as well. Like if you can do the programming, that's awesome. You're probably going to make a game that feels really smooth. And when people play your game, they're going to feel good about it. But there's this whole other side of the coin that I didn't realize, which is you got to get people to come try your game, right? And I think that comes down to, it comes down to marketing, of course, but art is just so much easier to show and market than some underlying system that you've built out. So that would be a specific bit of advice for, I guess, anyone with a software background trying to get into indie game development. But just a some general advice or general tip about getting into indie game development is just go and do it, right? And what I mean by not like just do it, right? Nike, but like, but really like, go and follow some YouTube tutorials. Go find a Brackeys tutorial about a game that you might want to make, and you don't have to understand everything that's going on. Just follow through and almost, I'm not going to say blindly follow through. Try to learn as much as you can while you're doing it, but you almost can kind of blindly follow through and just program along and do those things along, and you reach a point eventually where that starts to click, and then you feel like you can actually go do your own thing. And it's this huge, I think game development is this huge, overwhelming kind of thing, right? It involves so many skills, and it's more accessible today than it's ever been before. And I think that's inarguable.
Definitely.
But it still requires a lot of different skills, and I think it's really intimidating because of that. So play to your strengths, get into it, and go find some YouTube tutorials and learn those. Learn the things that you don't know. And that's a little bit of a rant, but yeah, I think that's probably what I would say to that.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
All right, let's close off this conversation with a non-game development related question. What are some of your favorite metal bands?
Ooh, man. Okay, so let's see. I'm really into. I don't know why this is always such a tough question. I really like a band called Phineas. I don't know if you ever heard of Phineas. I grew up on like Trivium, and I like some heavier bands like Chelsea Grin, for example. It's a lot of like really metalcore kind of stuff. And I know heavy metal's got so many different subgenres. So maybe I should ask you the same question. What kind of heavy metal bands are, if you're asking the question, I imagine.
Sure. Well, I live and breathe Dream Theater and
nice.
Megadeth, Fear Factory, Iron Maiden, I think are like my top 4. Anthony?
Nice. Okay. Very nice.
I'm really into 2 bands right now. One is called Bel Accord. I think that's how you pronounce them. The other one is impossible to say. They've got some like Norse name. It's like kind of like trying to say Yggdrasil or however you say that tree. It's like just a bunch of letters that don't even make sense. So it's really hard to say what the band is called. But,
that seems to be a lot of metal bands. Yeah.
yeah. And I think like the best metal concert I ever went to was Amon Amarth. They were incredible.
Oh, I love Amon Amarth. I was actually about to say Amon Amarth as well in my list.
Yeah, they're really good.
Yeah,
Amon Amarth is they're awesome. Just this total Viking metal kind of.
Yes.
They just represent their branding on what they do, and everything is just so well done.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, right on, guys.
All right, so that's going to be it for this episode. So today we've had Trever Mock, and it was an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, well, thank you guys so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. I thought it was an awesome conversation as well.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
So this has been Dev's Advocate. My name is Eric.
My name's Anthony, and we'll see you next time.